This is part 2 of our 1.3 liter Suzuki Samurai engine rebuild. Today we will be showing how to install pistons, piston rings, and rod bearings. The tools, parts, and supplies needed are pistons, connecting rod, rod caps, rod bearings, and nuts. Top compression or number 1 piston rings, middle compression or number 2 piston rings, oil rings that consist of 3 parts, 2 scrapers and a separator, rod stud protectors, plastic gauge, feeler gauge, torque wrench, ratchet, and a nut driver, all fitted with a 12mm socket, brake parts cleaner and assembly lube. We begin by checking our piston rings for proper fit.
We're going to check our ring end gap, and you're going to want to do this down the cylinder wall. Place the ring in, take your feeler gauge and check your gap. It's going to probably be around 12 thousandths. You can edit that if that's. And then you're going to drive the ring down. I just use a piston. Push it down evenly. Go down about halfway. Gonna check our gap. Seems to be good.
When you pull it up, you have to pull it up evenly, right?
Pull it up evenly as you can, yes. Don't bend the ring. And then we're going to just take our number 1 ring and just verify it. Nice and snug. You can usually count on the machine shop if you're familiar with them, and if you're familiar with the rings you're using, and don't change brands. Usually it's pretty consistent.
Although it's not required, it's a good idea to check all the ring gaps and all the rest of the cylinders.
We're going to get ready to install our pistons and rods. We're going to do number 1 and number 4 at the same time before we flip the block back over and connect them. So we want to make sure that the journals are as far away from the rod, so when setting your rod back in, it just doesn't obstruct your dropping in the rod. Chance of dinging it or marking up the crankshaft. We'll flip her back over. We've checked our ring gap, so we're going to take a little bit of assembly lube and we're just going to kind of wipe it along the top of the bore. So when we install our pistons, the rings have a nice slick transition. So we're going to take our first piston and we're going to install the oil ring spacer. Open and front of piston. I just kind of reference that as the 12 o'clock position, and so this would be in the 9 o'clock position where you put the oil spacer gap. So then when you put the lower ring in first, lower oil ring, and we're going to put it in the 1 o'clock position. Approximately 1 o'clock position. We just want to make sure that our oil rings are not lined up. So there's the gap, there's the front of the piston. And we'll take our upper oil ring, we'll install it in to approximately the 7 o'clock position. Just above the spacer for the gap. Make sure your rings float in there nice and freely. And then we're going to go to number 2 ring. We want to make sure that when we put the top of the ring that we verify we have the marking usually right on the edge, and that will go up. So then we're going to put our number 2 ring in approximately the 10 o'clock position. Make sure it floats in there. So then we're going to go with our number 1 ring, which also has a marking right on the open edge. And it's going to go in approximately the 5 o'clock position.
It's important to position ring end gap properly. If the ring end gaps align with each other, excessive oil consumption could result.
Make sure it floats freely in there. Verify all your piston rings are lined up. The position they need to be in. We're going to install our, put a little lubrication on this as well. Verify that you're going to have a top and bottom to the compressor. It's going to be indicated the bottom. So that's, and install your ring compressor. Make sure all your rings are tucked in under it. We want to install our rod bearing.
The rod bearings are interchangeable, meaning they will fit in the rod or the rod cap. What's important is to make sure that the notches of the bearing fit properly in the groove of the rod.
Install our guards. A wood or plastic handle, wrap your ring compressor down. It shouldn't take much effort. Drive that piston right down in there. And we're going to do the number 4 in the same way.
It's important to use caution here. Make sure that the rod studs do not scratch or mar the crank in any way.
Going to install our bearing into our caps. You want to make sure you keep the same bearing cap, rod cap to the same rod. Marked each one so you don't get these mixed up and put them onto a different rod. So then we're going to carefully guide our piston up without bumping your stud on the crankshaft. Pull up into position. Wipe the assembly lube off because you're going to be using plastic gauge. We're going to do number 1 and number 4. So now we're going to cut the plastic gauge. We need 4 of those. Do it in the same manner we did the main bearings.
We're using plastic gauge here to make sure that the machine shop has done a good job. We're measuring the clearance between the rod bearing and the crankshaft. If the clearance here is not accurate, you'll need to work with the machine shop and your parts supplier to resolve this concern.
I got number 1 cap goes to number 1 rod. Arrow forward. And we're going to torque these to 26 foot-pounds.
Rod caps are not interchangeable. It is critical that rod cap number 4 is installed on rod number 4, rod cap number 1 on rod number 1, and so forth. Additionally, you must ensure that the arrow on the rod cap is oriented forward.
So your 26 foot-pounds
Also, it's important not to move the crank with the plastic gauge in it.
correct.
Now we'll remove the rod caps and measure the plastic gauge.
Pull both of our caps. Good on that one. Tolerance on that one.
The thickness of our plastic gauge indicated that the rod clearance was approximately 0.51 millimeters.
Once you check that, you want to clean the plastic gauge off. everything off your caps. And we'll drop our rods back down so we can get some assembly lube in there.
Again, just a caution here not to damage the crank.
Just kind of saturate the bearing. Now we're going to Loctite the rod caps nuts with blue Loctite, and just going to put a little inside there. Whoa, a little too much. And then we're going to torque these at 24 or 26 foot-pounds. And we're going to repeat Now we're going to rotate the crankshaft. So number 2 and number 3 are all the way down out of the way.
Now we flip the engine over and install pistons 2 and 3 following the same procedure as we did with pistons 1 and 4. After all the pistons are in, we flip the engine over and lube the piston pens.
Alright, just drop some oil down there, and although there isn't a lot of oil assembly lube on the wrist pins already, I just like to be overcautious, I think, with it. Let's rotate it. You know, we're just gonna rotate this thing around 5-10 times. Just look at all the cylinder bores. Make sure you don't have some sign of a ring that got bent in there when you were installing it.
That concludes our piston installation. We remind you that all the parts and supplies required for this job can be purchased through our website at www.lowrangeoffroad.com or by calling 801 805 6644.